announced it the same day. After that, FDR made establishing the UN his top priority for post-war planning, just as the League of Nations had been to Wilson. At the UN's founding conference in San Francisco in 1945, most of the American delegates, 47, were CFR members.
The Korean War was designed to empower the UN. It had been the objection of some people that the UN could never actually enforce peace. And so, since the very first plank of the UN Charter says it's there to secure peace, this war was designed to validate the UN as peacekeeper. Even though 90% of the troops were American, it was said to be a UN action, and it was also a way of bypassing the Congress. We have never had a declaration of war since World War II. Once we got into the UN, that was it. Harry Truman sent troops to Korea without so much as consulting the Congress.
By instituting policies through, for example, the United Nations, they're able to say, here's something we want to happen to every single person on planet Earth. And I'll give you an example. A couple of years ago, Desmond Tutu, Bishop Desmond Tutu, came out in support of a United Nations plan to number all the children. Their concern was that not all of the kids being born on planet Earth were making their way into a government database where they were being numbered and tracked. And so they came out with a program called PLAN, that the phrase for this was, or their buzzword was, write me down, make me real.
America's post-war program of aid to Europe, the Marshall Plan, was allegedly the brainchild of General George Marshall, who proposed it in a Harvard commencement speech. In reality, it was not conceived by Marshall, but by a CFR study group with David Rockefeller as secretary. They originally intended President Truman to announce the proposal and call it the Truman Plan. However, after deliberating, they decided that Truman, a Democrat, might not win the support from congressional Republicans. Marshall, a CFR cohort, was chosen to reveal the plan because, as a military figure, he would be misperceived as politically neutral and win bipartisan support. The strategy worked.
The Marshall Event is one of those things that people recognize from the history books, but you read a basic summary and you gloss over it. But it has huge importance for the building of the global system that happened in the wake of World War II, when essentially power was up for grabs, and in fact had been negotiated ahead of time.
The Marshall Plan was just another giant welfare plan. It weakened America financially, certainly designed more for control of these little nations that they were rebuilding, a lot more than it was to help them.
Americans were told the funds were for Europe's needy. They were not told, however, that the goods their tax dollars purchased came mostly from multinational corporations linked to the CFR. The Marshall Plan was even more sinister. Unknown to most Americans, Europeans paid for Marshall Plan goods with printing press money called counterpart funds. CFR member John J. McCloy, appointed High Commissioner to Germany, was in charge of this cash. He was approached by Jean Monnet, renowned as founder of the Common Market, predecessor of today's European Union. Time called him the father of Europe. In 1947, Monnet sent agents to McCloy, who put millions of dollars in counterpart funds at their disposal. This money jump-started the movement for European unity. It financed common market propaganda and a European Union youth movement, as well as schools that would promote European consolidation, the Council of Europe's first meeting in 1949 and election campaigns of favored candidates. Journalist Richard Rovere called McCloy chairman of the establishment, an insider's insider. When he returned to the U.S., he became chairman of both the Council on Foreign Relations and the Rockefellers' Chase Manhattan Bank. McCloy was also second president of the World Bank, which, like its sister, the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, was started at the Bretton Woods Conference.
The Bretton Woods Agreement, where the IMF and World Bank were created, also created a reconstruction vehicle for Europe, which allowed the financial investments to flow through the central banks of choice and flow outward to what became American firms who got most of the business to rebuild Europe. It came with strings attached, and most of the European countries were under the yoke of U.S. command during the Reconstruction phase of what was known publicly as the Marshall Plan, but privately was concocted by the Wise Men, a group of very influential influential foreign policy people who are all members of the Council on Foreign Relations, and many of them also members of Skull and Bones. World War II was really about reshaping the world, giving birth to one version of the New World Order, which would be remade over and over again.
As with the Marshall Plan, the motive was never charity. After World War II, the New York banks wanted to continue loaning money to governments. However, what if war-torn nations had difficulty repaying? A fall guy was needed to guarantee the loans: taxpayers. The World Bank and IMF gave carte blanche to the private banks, who could now make virtually any loan, however foolish, to foreign governments. If the government could not make an interest payment, the IMF or World Bank would bail them out with taxpayer money.
Billions of 1944, 45, 47 taxpayer dollars were poured into the construction of Europe. Untold sums of money that flowed through the central banks and out to the fascist partners of choice who would get the bids and the contracts to rebuild Europe, while the Council on Foreign Relations policy people helped to rebuild Europe along the lines that they wanted to see. Economic controls, wage controls, industrial agreements, and what became the footprints and baby steps and building blocks of the European Union that we see today.
Jesse Helms, former chairman of the Senate's Foreign Relations Committee, said,
"The New York banks have found important profit centers in lending to countries plunged into debt. This has been an essentially riskless game for the banks because the IMF and the World Bank have stood ready to bail the banks out with our taxpayers' money."
Furthermore, the World Bank and IMF often attach conditions to these loans. They may demand a voice in government policy. For example, they might dictate that a country privatize industries to multinational corporations before money comes through. The World Bank and IMF are instruments of profit and control.
And the U.S. foreign policy based in Washington enabled it all the way and put the key people in position to outright rule Europe until it was rebuilt along the designs of not God, not man, not national governments, but the emerging world government based in the Council on Foreign Relations and their money powers.
I look at the World Bank and the IMF more or less as the next stage of the evolution of international banking.
The Bank for International Settlements, along with the World Bank and along with the IMF, have long been viewed as the engine of globalization. These have been the troika, if you will, that have impressed policies on countries all over the world to toe the globalist line.
We're told that this is necessary in order to regulate trade or in order to pacify nations that would be making war against us. But in fact, what this is about is creating debt.
People talk about the one world government or globalists as if we're just going to create one nation that all has the same name. But I don't think that's even necessary. We have banking systems that control the trade, they control what people do for a living. There are people who are living in African nations right now growing cotton in those nations. And those farmers are required to grow cotton because it's part of the debt payback that goes to these huge globalist banks who have made loans to the country. And they can't compete with other countries around the world. The farmers want to grow something else because their margins are so small, and they're not allowed to simply because of the debt that is owed by their nation.
Vietnam's a difficult one. Could the war have been won? Well, you probably know some Vietnam veterans, and a lot of them were harmed during the war. There's issues with things like Agent Orange. A lot of them are sour because there's just a lingering confusion about what really happened during that war.
Every war is won by the people who profit from it. It has always been the case because war is a racket, as Major General Smedley Butler said, always has been, always will be, poor men dying in rich men's wars. The Vietnam War was won by those who made billions from it.
Every war we've had, at least since World War II, there was not a clear objective as to what we were doing as a nation in going there. What was the objective in Vietnam? I'm not sure most people even still know today.
You can't win a war unless you know what winning it means. We tend to think that the purpose of the Vietnam War was to fight the Viet Cong. fight the communists. It wasn't. If that were the purpose of the war, we could have won it quite easily. But the real purpose of the war was much more complex than that.
Since World War II, it's very clear that every conflict we've been involved in doesn't make sense in terms of a clear objective of how to win, or why we win in the first place, what we're hoping to accomplish, other than if you were to say our goal is empire building. Now, if we had wanted to conquer the Vietnamese and ultimately occupy their nation, at least that's an objective that has a clear end game to it. But we didn't seem to want to do that. So what were we actually doing?
The reasons behind it seem very confusing unless you know about the banker issue, unless you understand how the engine of America has been hijacked by the banking powers and its nebulous, ill-advised policies directed by the Council on Foreign Relations.
Perhaps no 20th century event impacted America more than the Vietnam War. The war, which lasted 14 years and ended in defeat, was called unwinnable by the establishment media, who blamed the U.S. military, claiming they had underestimated the communist forces under Ho Chi Minh.
That war was part of the proxy wars that happened all around the globe in the name of fighting communism. But it was also a means of reconstructing the Asian Pacific sphere of influence to make it safe for globalism. Again, the whole world had to be made over and brought up to standards for globalism. China being such a major power, Japan more or less under the yoke of the post-World War II agreements, and Vietnam down there on the triangle had to be basically reformed. That was the real reasons for the war. What we were told as Americans was not that we were fighting for our freedoms, not that we were stopping an evil that would take over the whole planet, but that we had been attacked on a ship, the Gulf of Tonkin, an incident that we now know clearly in history didn't happen the way we were told at all.
The media's memory was short. After World War II, U.S. foreign policy dictated that France leave Vietnam. The United States initially supported Ho Chi Minh. In 1945, the OSS, forerunner of the CIA, trained Ho's army and provided him with guns and 20,000 cartridges, which he used to fight the French. The U.S. press glorified him. In 1946, Newsweek compared him to George Washington. In 1954, with its troops hemmed in by Ho's forces at the critical battle of Dien Bien Phu, France begged the United States to intervene. An aircraft carrier strike would have averted disaster, but the U.S. government refused. Following the French pullout and the division of Vietnam into the North and South, U.S. foreign policy's next objective was removing Emperor Bao Dai, the one man capable of uniting the country. Bao Dai exclaimed,
"If your country had given me 1,000 of the sum they spent to depose me, I could have won that war."
Through a rigged plebiscite, Ngo Dinh Diem, the CFR's choice, was installed as South Vietnam's president. The South Vietnamese hated the oppressive Diem, who drove many into the communist arms. In the meantime, CIA Colonel Edward Lansdale, CFR member, oversaw the disarming of three powerful anti-communist groups in Vietnam: the Cao Dai sect, Hoa Hao sect, and Le Van Bien's private army. Having sponsored Ho Chi Minh and destroying French, imperial, and local opponents at every level, our CFR policymakers now launched the tragic conflict. World War II. The USA fights on two fronts, Europe and the Pacific. The Germans and Japanese were tough and well-equipped, yet we crushed both military empires with our allies' help in just 3.5 years. On the other hand, we spent 14 years fighting Little North Vietnam and lost. Something is terribly wrong with this picture. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara forbid the Air Force to strike over 90% of the strategic targets it wanted to hit. As a CFR member, he left the Defense Department to become president of the World Bank. Then there were the rules of engagement, not declassified until 1985, when they consumed 26 pages of the Congressional Record's fine print. According to the rules, American soldiers were not allowed to shoot first, but had to wait until fired upon. If a pilot saw MiG on the ground, he could not attack. He had to wait until it was airborne and showing hostile intent.